What if a bride never truly dies? What if a village's silence hides a secret that has persisted for centuries? Ettenvale is a place where time bends, where brides vanish, and where one woman's presence refuses to leave. Who was Martha Dilling? And why does her story still linger in the shadows of the field she walked? Are you ready to uncover the truth, or are some mysteries meant to remain buried? If you want more stories like this one, forgotten, silenced, and those we should never forget, subscribe to the channel. The next case might already be knocking at your door. The roads leading to Ettenvale were narrower than any map could claim, hemmed in by dense forests whose shadows seemed to cling to the edges of the path. Elias Corbin had always been drawn to the obscure, the stories that lingered at the edge of reason, and this quiet stretch of Pennsylvania promised precisely that. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and wood smoke, though no chimneys punctuated the horizon. The only sounds were the restless whispers of wind through branches, and the occasional, distant creak of an unseen wagon wheel. Elias had first heard whispers of Ettenvale from an elderly archivist in Lancaster, who, with a trembling finger tracing old census rolls, muttered about a family line that had simply vanished from counting. The archivist's eyes darted nervously whenever the name Martha Dilling arose, as if pronouncing it aloud might summon her from some shadowed corner of time. According to fragmented records, she was a young bride, barely 22, whose fate had been erased from every ledger except those buried in parish graves that were unmarked, or worse, claimed by fire. By the time Elias reached the first cluster of homes, the sun had begun to sink behind the trees, staining the sky with bruised purples and sickly oranges. The village itself appeared frozen in a state that bordered on disbelief. Wooden fences leaned just slightly off kilter, their posts bleached gray by decades of wind and rain. Fields lay fallow or overgrown, their edges jagged and wild, yet careful, as if someone had tended them in whispers long after human hands had left. No one was in sight, yet doors shifted as he approached, responding to a presence invisible to the eye. A figure, slender, head bent under the weight of a bonnet, slipped between two houses and vanished. The villagers he met spoke softly, with an intentional economy of words, their English thick with an old Germanic cadence. They nodded politely, but their eyes avoided his. He asked about Martha Dilling, a name that seemed to coil in the mouths of those who remembered it. Each person answered the same way. A pause, a measured exhale, then a vague turn of the head toward the fields. None offered directions, none elaborated. There was no malice, only a careful avoidance, as if knowledge of her story carried a silent contagion. That night, Elias lay awake in the small room provided by a family whose hospitality was stiff, quiet, and precise. He could hear the soft tapping of horseshoes against the distant wooden planks of a barn, rhythmic and deliberate, though he had seen no animals. Then came the faint sound of voices, singing or chanting, it was hard to tell, rising in harmonics that were both beautiful and deeply wrong. The tones seemed to slip under the door, winding themselves around the bedposts and crawling into his ears. He counted them, whispering numbers to himself, but the sound never ceased, always starting again when he lost track. When Elias finally rose at dawn, he wandered toward the source. The barn stood silent now, ordinary, yet it carried a residue of something older, a heaviness that seemed to press against his chest. Embedded in the soil near the threshold were faint impressions of what could have been footprints, delicate, pointed shoes, not quite human in proportion. They led into the shadows at the rear of the barn, where the morning mist gathered thickly. He followed them, though a part of him knew he was trespassing on something he could neither name nor control. The fields whispered their secrets to him in the wind. There were patterns, symbols perhaps, etched into the earth so faintly they could be mistaken for weeds or furrows. But Elias felt their intent pressing against his mind, a subtle insistence. Some truths, once unearthed, demanded attention. Somewhere beyond, in the hidden corners of this village, Martha Dilling waited, or perhaps the echo of her did, stitched into the soil and the air, tangled in something older than the memory of man. By noon, he had pieced together fragments from hushed conversations, old gravestones with letters eroded into illegibility, and the faint traces of burned wood hidden in the undergrowth. A story began to emerge, but it was incomplete, jagged, like a reflection in a cracked mirror. Martha's existence seemed to hover between life and death, her presence a thread that tied Edenvale to something dark and enduring. Every person he questioned seemed to recognize the thread, yet none dared speak it fully, as though the act of telling could awaken it. Elias felt a creeping unease, a sensation of being observed by more than eyes. Each shadow he passed seemed to stretch toward him, listening, waiting. He knew he was not yet close, not yet ready to confront the truths hidden in this village, yet something, a faint, stubborn pull, compelled him to continue. He understood that some stories were never meant to be uncovered entirely, that the edge of understanding could be as terrifying as the abyss itself. And somewhere, in the silence between the wind and the tilled earth, a name lingered, carried like smoke: Martha Dilling. Elias awoke before dawn, the air heavy with a silence that pressed against his chest like a living thing. The village of Edenvale had shifted overnight, or perhaps, he thought, it revealed itself differently when darkness lingered too long, as if the night had a memory separate from his own. The homes remained still, their wood gray and unyielding, but the fields seemed closer, leaning toward the small cluster of streets in an almost predatory way. A faint mist clung to the ground, curling around his boots, and with every step he felt it tighten, constricting, as if guiding him along some invisible path he was neither invited nor equipped to follow. He wandered through the empty roads, listening to the wind as it threaded through the trees at the village's edge. Each gust carried an undercurrent of whispers, low, melodic, almost conversational, though he could not place their source. A horse whinnied somewhere far off, though he saw none, and the sound was swiftly followed by a soft clatter, like hooves tapping on distant boards, then vanishing entirely. The rhythm was deliberate, unnerving, and yet impossible to pinpoint. It seemed to circle him, slipping into the spaces between thought and perception. By mid-morning, Elias found himself at the periphery of the main square, a space that was empty, yet oddly central to everything that hummed beneath Edenvale's outward tranquility. The villagers appeared in brief flashes, passing at a distance, a man with a stooped back, a woman carrying a basket of vegetables so fresh they almost glowed with color, children who darted between shadows as if hiding from something unseen. Each acknowledged him with a nod, polite yet hollow, as if he were a figure in a story already written, a character whose lines he had yet to speak aloud. Questions about Martha Dilling surfaced again, rising in his mind like a tide he could not control. Every person he approached fell silent when her name slipped past his lips. Some lowered their gaze to the ground, others muttered phrases in a dialect older than the air he breathed. None spoke plainly, none confirmed or denied, and yet the fear or reverence around her lingered, almost tactile. It brushed against his sleeves as he passed, a sensation like cold silk sliding along bare skin. He realized then that the village itself carried her memory, its very rhythm attuned to her absence and presence simultaneously. By late morning, Elias stumbled upon the edge of the largest barn in the village. The doors were closed, but a faint glow seemed to leak from beneath the gaps, as though something inside rejected daylight entirely. He paused at the threshold, listening to the faint, almost imperceptible sound of humming, a low vibration that did not belong to any instrument or voice he could recognize. The tone resonated through the ground beneath his feet, through the soles of his boots, burrowing into his senses with an insistence that made the air feel thick, almost viscous. He continued to explore, stepping through narrow alleys where the houses leaned close enough to brush shoulders with him. The fields on either side of the village were strange. The crops were not planted in neat rows, but in patterns that twisted unnaturally, curving and spiraling in ways no plow could explain. Some stalks bore fruits and vegetables of impossible shapes, gnarled or discolored, yet strangely vibrant. The soil itself seemed to pulse beneath his hands, faintly, as if acknowledging the intrusion of an outsider, recording his presence in ways that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with ritual. By midday, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent. Elias realized he had been following an instinct rather than a path. The instinct pulled him toward a small cluster of trees behind the barn, where the ground was soft and littered with fallen leaves. Among them, the air grew colder, heavier, and he began to hear it clearly. Soft singing, carried from no visible source, layered in harmonics that unnerved his mind. The voices were familiar, yet alien, as if the village itself had learned to sing in a language older than memory. He counted the tones as best he could, but each repetition twisted subtly, changing in pitch and cadence, mocking his attempt at understanding. Elias sat among the roots of an ancient oak, pressing his palms to the ground, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath him. He sensed the stories lurking in the misted fields, the unspoken history pressing against his consciousness. There was a rhythm here, he realized, older than any structure, older than the village itself. And at the center of it, though unseen, there was a presence, Martha Dilling, or perhaps the echo of her, folded into the land, into the wind, into the uncountable hours that had passed since she had walked these fields. The thought sent a chill through him. The village of Ettenvale was waiting, waiting for what he could not say. But he knew instinctively that some answers were not given. They were extracted, slowly, insistently, from those willing or foolish enough to stay. By the third day, Elias had grown accustomed to the peculiar rhythm of Ettenvale. The villagers moved as though underwater, their gestures slow and deliberate, voices measured, almost rehearsed. Yet beneath this calm, a tension lingered, taut as a wire stretched across the village. It pressed upon him an unspoken expectation that he would notice, that he would understand, without being told. He had begun to speak less, listen more, and in the spaces between the wind and the creaking boards, he heard the first traces of Martha Dilling's story. He discovered the smokehouse by accident, a small, squat structure of blackened wood, tucked behind the northern edge of the village. It reeked faintly of old meat and ash, yet seemed strangely preserved, untouched by time or decay. While exploring, his hand brushed against a loose plank near the corner, and the wood shifted under his pressure, revealing a narrow cavity carved into the frame. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, brittle with age, its edges darkened by smoke. When he unwrapped it, the pages of a diary fell open, yellowed, the ink faded yet legible. The cover bore a name scrawled in a fine, deliberate hand, Martha Dilling. He began to read, and the words drew him immediately into another world, a cadence both intimate and alien. Martha wrote of dreams she could not explain, of shadows that lingered long after the light receded. She spoke of a figure she called Der Knechter, the Reaper, whose presence haunted her in the corners of empty rooms, in the rhythm of the wind against the walls, and most disturbingly, in the fields where no one else dared to tread. He read passages where she described planting seeds in the soil at odd hours, whispering names no one could hear, and watching them twist unnaturally, as if the earth itself remembered her words. Days in her diary blurred into nights. Each entry revealed a mind stretched between fear and fascination, devotion and defiance. She described the villagers with a mixture of intimacy and suspicion, recording gestures they would deny later, subtle signs that pointed toward rituals he could only guess at. One entry mentioned the wedding day, the fire that consumed the barn, and the absence of the groom, but even there, Martha's tone was detached, as though she had anticipated it, had orchestrated it with a knowledge that surpassed mere human foresight. The diary's pages were filled not only with text, but with diagrams, symbols that twisted across the margins in fine, jagged lines. Some resembled stars, others loops and spirals, all converging toward a central mark, a glyph that pulsed with an almost hypnotic insistence, hinting at a pattern beyond comprehension. The ink, Elias noticed, seemed to shift slightly when he blinked, as though it had been made not from pigment alone, but from something alive, something that thrived in darkness and heat. Elias became aware of a sound beneath the hum of the village, subtle but persistent, like the slow creak of wood settling or the heartbeat of the earth itself. Each word he read seemed to draw the sound closer, pressing against his thoughts, reminding him that Martha had been more than a woman. She was a node, a hinge between the living and some other presence, bound to the rhythm of Ettenvale in ways he could barely fathom. As he turned the last page of that bundle, the final entry chilled him. Martha wrote of a night when she walked through the village, cloaked in her wedding dress, unseen by all, and whispered to the soil, to the wind, and to a presence she named but did not explain. The entry ended abruptly, a line scratched deep into the paper, jagged and desperate, the meaning undecipherable yet unmistakably urgent. Elias closed the diary, pressing it to his chest, and realized he had found not a record of the past, but a key to the persistence of something very much alive. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the scent of smoke, ash, and earth. It moved through the village with purpose, as if it knew he held the diary, as if it had been waiting for him to read those words. In that moment, Elias understood that he was no longer merely observing Edenvale. He was implicated in it, drawn into a history of shadows that stretched further than any map could show, further than any ledger could mark. Martha Dilling was here, or rather, she had never left, and in the silence of the smokehouse, her presence began to make itself known. The story of Martha Dilling's wedding day was whispered in fragments, scattered across decades and memories that refused clarity. Elias traced the tale through the villagers' hushed remarks and the brittle pages of her diary, assembling a picture of a day that had never truly ended. Martha had been promised to a man whose name survived only in rumor. The congregation had gathered in the barn, the air heavy with expectation, the floor swept clean and polished to a subtle gleam. Candles lined the rafters, and the scent of straw and wood smoke hung faintly above the assembled families. Yet, the groom had never arrived, and what followed was no accident, no misfortune of simple circumstance. According to the sparse records, the barn erupted in fire, sudden and unnatural, consuming the structure with a ferocity that seemed almost sentient. Those inside had little chance to escape. 3 villagers died that day, their names lost to faded tombstones or gravestones that had succumbed to weather and time. Martha, however, did not perish. Witnesses recalled seeing her among the flames, her dress catching sparks that curled around her like snakes, yet she emerged without a singe upon her skin. She appeared as though the fire itself had bowed to her presence, parting in reverence or fear. Elias could not tell which. The villagers' recollections diverged here. Some claimed she had been carried away by unseen hands, lifted into the air by a force that made no sense to reason or faith. Others insisted she had vanished silently into the woods, her footprints swallowed by ash and soil, leaving only the echo of her laughter behind. What none could explain was why the community had never spoken of her openly, why mirrors were subsequently removed from every household, replaced by blank walls and opaque surfaces. Every reflection, they believed, invited her gaze, a haunting that could linger across generations. Elias traced the perimeter of the barn, now rebuilt but still smelling faintly of burnt timber, and he felt the weight of absence pressing against him. There was a sense that the space itself remembered, that the charred beams carried a resonance of what had occurred. Martha's presence lingered like smoke, clinging to the walls long after the flames had faded, an invisible imprint of intent and awareness. The villagers' cautious distance was no superstition. They spoke in circumspection because the memory of that day demanded it, and the memory had not faded. The diary described her emotions in that moment, paradoxical and confounding. Martha wrote of calmness amidst chaos, of fascination rather than terror, and of a connection to the fire that was almost reverential. She referred to a presence she called Der Knechter, the Reaper, who whispered that the event was necessary, that it was a rite not of destruction, but of transformation. The pages hinted that the barn had been more than a gathering place. It had been a threshold, a site where the mortal and the other could brush against each other. Elias felt a cold certainty settle in him as he read. The fire had not ended Martha Dilling's story. It had marked it, sealed it into the village itself. Time in Edenvale did not flow in the ordinary way. It shifted and twisted around her, preserving moments that should have been lost, maintaining a presence that refused conclusion. The villagers' silence was not obedience alone. It was survival. They knew that to speak of her carelessly was to invite something beyond reckoning, to awaken an awareness that had lingered patiently for decades. The afternoon light began to waver as Elias lingered, sensing the edges of reality strain. Shadows pooled unnaturally beneath the barn's corners, and the faintest warmth of the old fire seemed to linger in the beams, as though waiting. He imagined her there, moving unseen, observing the repetition of human lives with quiet amusement or judgment. Each step he took, each breath, felt recorded by forces older than the village itself. Martha Dilling was neither absent nor fully present. She was a memory, a warning, and perhaps a promise, all at once. And in the stillness of the barnyard, the thought struck him. The day she was meant to marry had never truly ended. Ettenvale's fields were not as other fields. Elias had noticed it on his second morning, but only now did the pattern emerge with a clarity that sent unease through his chest. Crops were sown, not in rows that obeyed seasons, nor in lines that respected sunlight or water, but in spirals, arcs, and angles that seemed almost ritualistic. Vegetables and grains twisted into grotesque forms, some gnarled, others unnaturally vibrant, yet each thriving beyond what logic would allow. The villagers moved among them with careful hands, speaking little, as if they were guardians of a secret older than the land itself. The cycles were inverted. Seeds were planted during the shortest days of winter, when frost lay thick and soil resisted the touch. Harvests followed at times that defied reason, crops ripening when they should have withered, yielding fruits and vegetables that shimmered with a color unnatural to their kind. Elias felt a growing weight of observation pressing against him, as if the earth itself recorded his presence. Every step among the twisted plants seemed noted, catalogued, a silent ledger that measured trespass and attention alike. By the third day of wandering, he discovered subtle signs among the soil, small stones carved with sigils, nearly invisible unless bent to catch the sunlight at a precise angle. Their pattern suggested a language older than any he could read, yet he felt the meaning pressing against his mind. Lines curved into circles, circles nested within spirals, and spirals opened into forms that seemed to pulse when he gazed too long. Elias realized that this was more than cultivation. It was ritual. Each planting, each harvest, each careful tending of the soil was bound to a force beyond human comprehension, an adherence to a law written in silence and shadow. At night, the air carried a different weight, one that rustled the leaves with the sound of whispers. The wind did not move through the fields. It traced paths through the rows, guiding unseen hands over the crops. Occasionally, Elias would wake to the faint smell of smoke and iron, or the soft vibration of the earth beneath his feet. The soil seemed alive with memory, holding the echo of generations who had walked here, who had planted not only seeds, but intentions, desires, and perhaps pacts that could not be named aloud. Elias noticed that the villagers rarely spoke of these cycles in ordinary terms. To outsiders, the logic appeared chaotic, the patterns inexplicable, yet they tended the fields with a reverence that bordered on fear. Conversations about planting or harvest were indirect, laced with idioms that hinted at consequences beyond the ordinary. Phrases about the balance and the watching recurred, leaving Elias to piece together fragments of understanding from what was deliberately withheld. He sensed that every harvest was not merely sustenance, but a continuation of an order that had persisted since Martha Dilling's time, bound to her presence even if she no longer walked the soil in form. On the fourth day, he noticed faint depressions in the ground, almost imperceptible, forming circles and arcs that led away from the fields into the woods beyond the village. He traced them carefully, the soil soft underfoot, each step heavy with the knowledge that the earth bore witness. The impressions ended at a ring of stones, each marked with symbols similar to those in Martha's diary, twisted glyphs that seemed to hum faintly beneath his palm. Elias felt the pulse of the place, slow and insistent, and understood that the land itself was a keeper of secrets, a participant in rituals whose logic he could barely comprehend. The inverted harvest was more than agriculture. It was devotion, fear, and memory, crystallized in soil and plant. Elias felt the edges of the village close in, the wind and earth aligning in a rhythm he had not yet learned to interpret. He realized that Ettenvale existed not only as a settlement, but as a vessel for continuity, each harvest a thread in a tapestry that included Martha Dilling and forces that resisted naming. And in the silence between the wind and the fertile ground, Elias understood. To witness the fields was to witness her presence, in all its patience and quiet insistence, stretching across decades to claim attention, if not obedience. The whispers of disappearances had circulated in Ettenvale for generations, though the villagers never spoke them aloud. Elias learned the pattern through fragmented remarks and veiled warnings, piecing together the cadence of events that no outsider could comprehend without immersion. Every 27 years, a young woman of marriageable age vanished from the community, her absence noted only in hushed tones and unmarked spaces within the congregation's memory. These women had been preparing for marriage, their days structured with the quiet devotion of the Amish, yet each had been claimed by something beyond the ordinary flow of life. Elias traced the pattern meticulously, consulting diaries, local records, and oral accounts that shifted with each telling. The disappearances coincided with the bundling ritual, a tradition in which courtship required a shared night of sleeping in proximity without physical contact. It was a custom bound to trust and restraint, yet in Ettenvale it seemed to attract an unseen force. Each missing woman, Elias realized, had been on the threshold of matrimony, a bride awaiting union in a community whose timeline did not conform to normal rules. He discovered a photograph in a tattered album, stored in the back of a villager's home under a pile of aged linens. The image showed a woman in a wedding dress, half burned along the hem, her eyes veiled, her posture rigid and formal, yet familiar in a way that set his teeth on edge. The date scribbled in faded ink read 1919. The resemblance to Martha Dilling was undeniable. The realization struck him with a weight that left his thoughts in fragments. She had appeared again, decades later, unchanged, marking the rhythm of these disappearances, stretching across generations as if she were a constant and the women themselves were offerings to her presence. Elias sought out Naomi, the young ex-Amish who had reluctantly agreed to guide him through the village's more hidden histories. She revealed that the ritualized absences were treated with a grim practicality. The families spoke of them as relocations or departures, but no one questioned the recurrence. The elders viewed the events as necessary, a compliance with a pact older than any living memory. Each missing bride was said to have joined the promise, a phrase whispered with reverence and fear, the meaning left deliberately vague. The alignment of the photograph, the ritual, and the cyclic pattern created a disquieting symmetry. Elias could feel the threads of past and present entwining, the village itself bound to an order that remained impervious to time. Martha's influence appeared to extend beyond death or absence, anchoring the cadence of events and ensuring continuity. Her presence, a constant observer of each new generation. The village's obedience was not merely cultural, it was defensive. They acted to survive, to maintain an equilibrium that might otherwise collapse under the weight of her return. That night, Elias lay awake, considering the photograph, the diary, and the invisible circle of vanished women. He sensed the repetition of ritual in the air, in the whispering wind through the trees, in the subtle pulse beneath his feet. He imagined Martha walking the fields in the guise of each new bride, a spectral thread connecting past and present, ensuring the continuity of what had begun decades ago. The thought filled him with dread. Each cycle, though unseen, was deliberate, an orchestration of events that would repeat, unnoticed by the world outside Ettenvale. As dawn approached, the forest beyond the fields seemed alive with quiet expectancy. Elias understood that the village's rhythm, its agriculture, its silence, and the vanished brides were all linked. Martha Dilling's presence had endured, folded into the land, the air, the lives of those who lived within its bounds. And somewhere, in the space between recognition and memory, she waited again, patient and unyielding, marking the next iteration of a pattern that had no clear beginning and, Elias feared, no end. The barn stood at the edge of the village, rebuilt yet burdened with the memory of fire and absence. Elias approached it with a sense of hesitation that had no rational cause, as though the air itself warned him of what lingered within. He had come seeking fragments of Martha Dilling's presence, and the diary he carried pulsed with anticipation, a latent force pressing against the pages. As he entered, the temperature seemed to drop, subtle at first, then sharply, the cold threading into his bones, settling like ash in the marrow. Inside, the scent of charred wood was faint but persistent, curling around him as he moved through the space. The rafters above bore their old scars, blackened lines etched across the beams, yet the barn felt alive in a way that defied explanation. Elias noticed the floorboards underfoot were uneven, warped, as if memory itself had pressed into them. Shadows clung to corners, shifting imperceptibly, and he felt the sensation of being watched, of presence folding around him without form or substance. He opened the diary to a page previously untouched, the ink faintly shimmering, as if aware of his gaze. Martha wrote of a night when she walked unseen through the barn, cloaked in her wedding dress, while flames licked the rafters yet never consumed her. She spoke of smoke entering her eyes, of seeing past and future entwined, of glimpsing the lives that would never occur because of her choices. Her words described a vision in which the villagers moved according to a rhythm she dictated, unknowing yet bound to her influence. The passages were unsettling in their calm detachment, a serenity that belied the chaos she described. As Elias read, a faint movement in the air caught his attention. The smoke from decades past seemed to linger, curling unnaturally along the beams, forming shapes that suggested eyes watching him. He realized that Martha's observations were not metaphorical. She had recorded not only events, but the subtle presences that moved through the barn, those that the village ignored or could not perceive. It was as if she had imprinted herself into the very architecture, leaving a trace that persisted, waiting for the curious or the foolish to enter. He traced the walls with his hands, feeling the grooves and fissures, each one a repository of memory. The symbols from her diary appeared etched faintly into the wood, jagged and irregular, forming patterns that seemed to pulse when touched. Each mark resonated with a rhythm that matched the subtle vibrations under his feet, as though the barn itself were a conduit, a vessel for something beyond life and death. The intensity of the presence grew, pressing against his mind, whispering in a language older than sound, a cadence that bypassed understanding and settled directly into thought. Hours passed, though he could not measure them. The barn seemed to stretch in time, elongating moments until they became dense, nearly unbearable. He felt the weight of generations, of the cycles Martha had orchestrated, pressing down upon him. The diary indicated that her awareness had extended beyond the limits of mortal life, tied to the fire, the smoke, and the rhythm of the village itself. She was not bound by the physical plane. She was a force, patient and deliberate, observing, recording, and shaping events without need for presence. As he prepared to leave, Elias sensed a shift in the barn, a quiet pulse, like a heartbeat under the floorboards. It was subtle, yet undeniable. The smoke seemed to settle in patterns, the air thick with a presence he could not name. He understood, with a clarity that sent cold fire through his veins, that he had entered a space not merely haunted, but claimed. Martha Dilling, or the essence she had become, had been waiting, her eyes of smoke watching, patient and eternal, folding the past and future into a singular awareness that refused to release him. Elias found him at the far edge of the village, an old man hunched beneath the weight of nearly a century. Abraham Dilling's hands were gnarled, his skin thin as parchment, yet his eyes were sharp, piercing through the veil of time with an unsettling clarity. When Elias approached, the wind seemed to shift, carrying a subtle tremor through the branches overhead. The old man did not greet him, nor did he move with any sense of surprise. It was as if he had been waiting, knowing that someone would come to listen, someone would seek the truths buried beneath decades of silence. Abraham spoke slowly, each word deliberate, measured, as though carefully weighing the consequences of revelation. He confirmed what Elias had suspected. Martha Dilling had never truly died. The fire had been a boundary, not a terminus, a ritualized separation that allowed her to persist outside ordinary existence. She chose, Abraham said, his voice barely above a whisper, to remain between worlds. The village did not bind her. We merely endured, and learned not to awaken what she carries. The words carried an odd mixture of resignation and reverence, as though the act of speaking them might summon her closer. The old man described the patterns Elias had noticed, the vanished brides, the inverted harvests, the timing of ceremonies and rituals, all as threads in a larger design orchestrated by Martha's continued presence. He spoke of her awareness, extending beyond the corporeal, observing the village through the smoke, the wind, and the land itself. Each act of cultivation, each careful tending of the crops, each unspoken rule of the community was in response to her influence, an acknowledgement of a power that refused to be named. Abraham's confession wove through generations, recounting tales passed silently from parent to child, stories so meticulously veiled that outsiders would dismiss them as superstition or exaggeration. Each disappearance, each anomaly in the village's rhythm, was tied to her, a constant witness, and, in some ways, arbiter. "We do not adore her," he said, shaking his head slowly. "But we fear what comes if she notices carelessness. Her gaze is patient, insistent, and eternal. Time is not the same for her. She moves through it as we move through the day." Elias pressed for more, but the old man's eyes narrowed, and he stopped. The air seemed to thicken around them, charged with an unseen presence. Abraham continued in a lower voice. Martha's existence was not bound to flesh or decay. The fire had marked her, yes, but it had not ended her. She remained, folded into the cycles of the village, watching, waiting, ensuring the continuity of her designs. "Each generation," he said, "offers something to her. Each promise, each bride, each harvest. These are threads she measures, and she waits for those threads to fray, to test the weave." Elias felt a cold weight settle over him, the kind that bypassed thought and settled directly in the chest. Abraham spoke of encounters he had never witnessed, of shadows that moved with intent, of whispers that carried across decades. Martha had persisted, patient and deliberate, marking time in ways that no ordinary consciousness could perceive. The old man's confession drew a line between legend and reality, revealing that Edenvale was a crucible, a vessel for continuity, and that Martha's presence, far from being passive, actively shaped the lives and the land around her. As Elias left Abraham's side, the wind seemed to follow, carrying the faint, persistent scent of smoke and ash. He realized that the village's order, its silence, and its rituals were all responses to a being who had chosen to endure beyond mortality. Martha Dilling was no longer a memory, nor simply a story. She was a force interwoven with the village, a patient observer whose influence stretched into the present with a quiet, inexorable power. The forest beyond the village carried a weight that Elias had not anticipated, a density in the air that seemed to press against thought itself. Naomi led him through a narrow path hidden beneath low-hanging branches, the soil soft beneath their boots, absorbing their passage without a sound. She moved with the certainty of one familiar with every contour of the land, yet her expression was tight, guarded. They approached a clearing where the air was unnaturally still, and the ground held a recent disturbance, subtle but undeniable. A grave had been dug, shallow and unmarked, its edges fresh with displaced soil. There was no headstone, no name, yet the place radiated a presence that made Elias's stomach coil. Naomi knelt, running her fingers along the surface, revealing a fragment of cloth buried just beneath. It was delicate, almost ethereal, yet unmistakably the remnants of a wedding veil. The fabric was cool to the touch, exuding a faint sweetness mixed with the sharp tang of iron, as if it had absorbed the memory of something violent. Elias felt the pulse of the land beneath him, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. He opened the diary to the final entry, one he had avoided until now. Martha wrote of an existence that transcended the ordinary, of moving unseen through spaces and observing the lives she had influenced. She spoke of the third grave, of how each generation offered a token to her persistence, and how the land absorbed these tokens, keeping them as reminders of promises made. The writing was frantic, yet controlled, the ink smeared in places, as though the page had been touched by more than human hands. Each line carried urgency, a warning of continuity, of cycles that could not be broken without consequence. As Elias read, he became aware of movement at the periphery of the clearing. Shadows shifted among the trees, too fluid and deliberate to be the play of sunlight or wind. He caught glimpses of a figure, fleeting and veiled, dressed in the folds of white and ash. The air thickened, carrying a scent both familiar and alien, the lingering trace of smoke and sweetness. His pulse quickened, the diary trembling slightly in his hands, as though it responded to the presence in the clearing. He felt observed, studied, as if each thought were catalogued and measured by something beyond his comprehension. Naomi whispered, almost inaudibly, that those who disturbed the graves did so at their own risk, that the presence could be patient for decades but would notice, always. Elias sensed the truth in her words. This was no ordinary haunting. Martha Dilling's essence had persisted, folded into the land, the soil, and the veil, waiting and watching, marking the cycles of the village with unerring precision. Each grave, each ritual, each absence in the village's rhythm was an echo of her ongoing presence, a continuity of influence stretching across time and space. He traced the soil with his fingers, feeling the subtle resistance beneath his touch, a firmness that seemed unnatural for a freshly turned grave. The veil was smooth, almost alive, shifting slightly under his hand, and he realized with a cold certainty that Martha's presence was not confined to memory or legend. It extended into the present, bending the space around the grave, holding it in stasis, an anchor between generations. Elias understood then that the village's silence, the rituals, and the vanished brides were not merely traditions, they were offerings, accommodations, and acknowledgments of a force patient and deliberate, observing the passage of time as if it belonged solely to her. The forest remained still as they rose, the clearing holding its breath. The pulse beneath the earth did not cease. The veil remained warm to the touch, a reminder of presence, of attention, of a cycle that would continue. Elias felt the weight of it pressing against his mind, a persistent insistence that no rational understanding could satisfy. He understood that Martha Dilling had never left, that each generation of Edenvale existed under the quiet dominion of her awareness, and that the third grave was both an endpoint and a promise. She was watching, waiting, and counting. The invitation came not as words, but as an inevitability, a pull that Elias could not resist. The village, silent and watchful, guided him toward a house at the heart of Edenval, one that seemed both familiar and impossibly old. Inside, the air was thick, carrying the faint aroma of raw vegetables and bread, of earth and smoke mingled in a way that unsettled the senses. The table was long and precise, set as if for a gathering that would never conclude, each plate aligned with geometric perfection, each cup waiting to be filled. The villagers were already seated, their movements measured, deliberate. They spoke little, and the few words exchanged held the weight of unspoken understanding. Elias took his place, acutely aware that one seat remained conspicuously empty, the space preserved with an unyielding insistence. It felt as if the absence at that place defined the order of the room, an acknowledgement of a presence beyond perception, shaping the ritual without uttering a single syllable. He realized then that the banquet was not merely a meal, it was a continuation, a repetition of observance and deference that spanned generations. He watched the shadows along the walls, shifting subtly as though alive, stretching and recoiling with a rhythm that was not dictated by light or source. The air seemed to vibrate faintly with murmurs, harmonics that threaded through the space in a cadence too precise to be accidental. The villagers' eyes avoided the empty seat, yet their awareness of it was palpable, an energy that pressed against the edges of consciousness. Elias felt that every movement, every breath, every hesitation was noted, absorbed into the order of the room, measured and weighed by a force he could not see. The diary in his hands throbbed faintly, a pulse that aligned with the presence in the room. Martha Dilling's final entries spoke of observation, patience, and the extension of her will through absence as well as presence. Each cycle, each offering, each bride who vanished or conformed to the rituals of Edenvale was accounted for, a ledger of influence that transcended conventional understanding. Elias felt himself drawn into the rhythm, a participant whether he desired it or not, bound by the continuity she enforced. The villagers served the meal, their movements meticulous, yet the absence of the one place was a focal point that dominated the room. The sensation of being watched intensified, emanating from that empty seat, filling the space with a weight that bypassed reason. The air vibrated with expectancy, a cadence that hinted at past events and future repetitions. Elias realized with sudden clarity that the cycle was unending, The village existed not merely in space, but in devotion and fear, shaped and sustained by the enduring presence of Martha Dilling. He glanced toward the doorway, the edges of the room trembling with a subtle distortion, and for a brief instant, he saw a figure, white, veiled, and impossibly still, standing where no one had entered. The heartbeat beneath the floorboards accelerated. The diary warmed against his chest. Every fiber of his being sensed the truth. Martha's influence was absolute, patient, and eternal. The banquet was not for sustenance, nor was it ceremonial in any ordinary sense. It was acknowledgement, submission, and recognition of a presence that had endured beyond mortality, measuring, waiting, and counting with meticulous intent. Elias felt the pull to rise, to leave, yet understood instinctively that no departure could sever the rhythm. The village, the shadows, the empty seat, and the lingering pulse of the diary were all extensions of the same order, the same patient insistence. Time in Etonvale was no longer his own, and the cycles of Martha Dilling would continue, precise and unbroken. Somewhere beyond awareness, she waited, her presence folding past, present, and future into a continuum that would not release him or anyone else until the pattern was satisfied. And in that room, heavy with the inevitability of centuries, Elias realized the unending truth. Some presences do not leave, and some stories are never concluded.